Right, so next we're reading Cognitive Science of Philosophy Symposium, Metaethics and Experimental Philosophy. I don't even know what experimental philosophy is. It's very interesting. Oh, sorry, let's zoom in a little bit. So it's readable. Oh, I think, whoa, that's a little bit too big. But we can do that, and then I can, move over here. All right. Right, experimental philosophy. Wait, did I miss this? Okay. Welcome to the Brain's blog Symposium series on the cognitive science of philosophy. The aim of the series is to examine the use of methods from the cognitive sciences to generate philosophical insight. I like cognitive sciences, yeah. Each symposium is comprised of 2 parts. In the target post, a practitioner describes their use of the method under discussion and explains why they find it philosophically fruitful. A commentator then responds to the target post and discusses the strengths and limitations of the method. Interesting. In this symposium, Pascale Willemsen discusses the experimental study of thick ethical terms with Bianca Cepelero providing commentary. All right. Metaethics and experimental philosophy, a journey through thick and thin. Right. Sounds a bit interesting, yeah. Right. Experimental philosophy is an interdisciplinary approach to philosophical questions and problems that uses empirical methods from various cognitive scientific disciplines, such as psychology, experimental linguistics, and neurosciences. I'm interested in all of these. I like this. Yeah. Even though experimental philosophy is a relatively recent movement and has only been around for 25 years, its practitioners have shown remarkable productivity. In January 2021, roughly 2,000 papers were listed as experimental philosophy on philpapers.org. Alright. That is something that I want to save for later, yeah. philpapers.org. Right. Roughly 1/4 of these papers were categorized as ethics. In this article, I would like to focus on one specific sub-discipline of moral philosophy that I argue can benefit greatly from engaging with experimental philosophy, namely metaethics. Alright, metaethics, from my understanding, right, it's just beyond ethics. Beyond ethics? What is ethics and how can we get knowledge about the thing, right? Right, I'm curious, right? It's gonna be very narrow-minded, but I kind of feel like it is kind of assuming what's that? Assuming the antecedent, begging the question, right? Because this first thing is kind of saying that experimental philosophy is a great thing that uses, right? It describes what it is and what it does, and then it argues why it should be used in metaethics. But the point is that, right, experimental philosophy can be used in any type of philosophy, right? Not only metaethics. So why argue for its use?
Armed? Huh? What do you mean armed? Armed with what? Bad breath, colourful language, feather duster. What do you think?
Right, it's kind of experimental philosophy. They've already argued that it is used in ethics, right? Alright, we'll see where it goes. It kind of feels... The arguments of this paper seems kind of redundant, but we'll see where we end up. Right, as Sire McCord 2014 said, metaethics is the attempt to understand the metaphysical, epistemological, semantic, and psychological presuppositions and commitments of moral thought, talk, and practice. exactly, yeah. Central to metaethics are, among others, questions about the meaning of ethical terms such as good and bad, whether moral statements containing these terms can be true or false, what it is that people express or do by using moral language, and how moral language relates to motivation and behavior. Oh wow, that was a long sentence, wasn't it? Oof, a mouthful. Alright, true or false is just a system, right? In some systems, they can be true or false, and in others, they cannot, right? There is no such thing as objective trueness or falseness, right? True and false are... they are values that we ascribe statements, right? The statement is true or false, and a statement is necessarily abstract, right? Yeah, it's a statement about the world, something imagined by us. It's language, right? It's by its very nature arbitrary. So it can be true or false in that sense. That's where I come from. I'm just showing my understanding of these things. So definitely, depending on what kind of framework you're using, right? It's clear that these questions demand at least partially empirical answers. Demand? I'm not sure that it demands. Personally, I prefer systems that uses empirical ways to do things. Alright, and that is what the argument is for, right? Experimental philosophy is empirical in its nature. It's doing scientific research. Yeah. I mean, this song sounds interesting. It also... it's in the way for me, yeah. Right. It seems absurd to claim that we can properly understand the meaning of ethical terms and what people express and do with them without looking at the way people actually talk. Yeah. Additionally, it would be highly questionable to make any claims about moral language and its relationship to motivation and subsequent behavior without consulting or conducting empirical studies. I disagree, right? Right. When we're talking about science, usually there's like in the broad sense, you can talk about two different approaches to science, right? One being quantitative and one being qualitative, right? And philosophy usually tend towards the qualitative stuff, right? And they are just arguing for some more empirical, quantitative, right? Oh, not qualitative, but quantity, right? Getting the statistics as a way to increase the knowledge about the topic at hand, which I'm all for, but right? It's not questionable doing qualitative stuff, right? That's usually what philosophy is all about, and that is what this text is about, right? This text is not an empirical study, right? So it's not highly questionable to write this text without having empirical evidence for what you're doing, right? For the sake of this article, it is impossible to cover all there is to say about the relevance of experimental methods for metaethics. Of course, yeah. What I wish to do instead is draw attention to a recent project in experimental metaethics that aims to understand thick ethical claims. I don't even know what that is, so I'm interested. Let's find out. Right. Part 2. Concepts such as rude, cruel, friendly, and compassionate are what philosophers call thick ethical concepts. Rude, cruel, friendly, compassionate. Right? They are characterized by their provision of both evaluative and descriptive content. All right, yeah, I describe something as rude, right? Asking a woman if she's pregnant might be considered rude. In, like, you know the context I'm exemplifying, right? That would be rude. So it describes, it is descriptive of the kind of behavior. Yeah, and I make a value judgment about it, calling it rude. Alright, so I'm wondering, what are some evaluative concepts that are not descriptive? Oh, bad, for example. That is bad. That is just an evaluation and doesn't really describe anything. Right? They communicate that an action, behavior, custom, person, or character trait is viewed with approval or disapproval, and they further communicate in virtue of what descriptive feature they are evaluated in this way. Oh man, I lost track of that sentence. Right, they communicate that an action, behavior, custom, person, or character trait is viewed with approval or disapproval. Right, a person can be seen as rude. Oh, right, yeah. A person can be rude. Sure. And they further communicate in virtue of what descriptive features they are evaluated in this way. Well, I can't stop yawning, eh? This second part of the sentence confuses me a bit. In contrast, thin ethical concepts such as good and bad, oh, here we go, are said to be merely evaluative. Alright, yeah, it just describes, you can describe a person as being rude. You cannot really describe a person as being bad. Well, Michael Jackson did it, I suppose. But it's more vague, it's more focused, right? We can probably make it into a scale, right? Where words can be more or less, right? That a lot of adjectives can be, right, where there is value judgments built into the adjectives. And they also have a descriptive value, but we have a scale, right? How descriptive something is and how evaluative something is. Right? The more you evaluate, the more evaluative it becomes, the vaguer, the more vague it is. Maybe? Thick and thin? So good and bad are thinner since they are more evaluative. Oh, I would have put it the other way around, but oh, okay. Well, the thicker something is, the more descriptive it is. Maybe? With such a rough and ready notion of thick concepts in mind, philosophers have sought to provide a proper definition for these concepts and spell out more clearly how thick concepts may differ from thin concepts. Oh, no, they're actually saying that they are essentially different, not a scale then. Okay? As well as from descriptive concepts such as green or round. That's a very good point, yeah. Green doesn't have, well, yeah, it doesn't have any implicit descriptiveness at all. Oh, or I mean, evaluative. What was that word? Evaluative. It doesn't have any evaluative values at all. Round, either. Depending on context, right? So, my question then is, because good and bad can be used as descriptors as well, right? She's into the bad boys. That's a descriptive use of the word. So I'm curious, what would be pure thin ethical concepts? Right, since... Oh wow, I don't... This was too long, I wanted something shorter. Where is Wikipedia when you need it? Oh wow. So we can read full papers on this thing, eh? Alright. Let's just take the paper's word for it that there is an essential difference. I mean, there is an essential difference between green and bad, and green and cruel. Or greedy. Green and greedy, yeah. Alright. As many philosophers in the debate readily admit, the attempt to define thick concepts is a long way from being accomplished. Discussions and significant disagreements has revolved around 5 central questions. Separability questions. Yeah, I mean, it's easy to separate green from good and rude, right? Since it has no evaluation. But the examples being used here seems weird. It's like these are more scalar in their approach, yeah. Alright, so separability, location, centrality, variability, and action-guidingness question. Right, it is beyond the scope of this article to do justice to the complexity of the entire debate. For now, let us focus on 2 questions in more detail. Determine what empirically testable predictions they make and analyze how experimental philosophers have started examining them. Alright, sure. So the location question of thick and thin asks where exactly we can find the evaluative dimension of a thick term or concept. That's a good question. The 2 options discussed are A, that evaluation is part of the semantic content of a thick term, or B, that it belongs to what is pragmatically conveyed beyond what is literally said. It's part of the semantic content of a thick term, or it belongs to what is pragmatically conveyed beyond what is literally said. So it's between the lines. Either it's literally there, or it's between the lines. I would say it's implied, right? If you want to make a pure distinction. Right? And I'm not even sure that is possible, right? Part of me thinks that the thick and thin is... the distinction itself might be problematic, right? From where I'm standing at the moment. Right, that I'm not even sure that there like such a thing as a purely thick term. Wait. Purely thin term. Purely thin term is a thing. Good and bad is not purely, right? They can be descriptive. So I would say, like with my scalar idea, right? Alright. The philosophical literature often relies on intuitions about whether statements such as Tom is cruel, but he's not bad sound contradictory. They do sound contradictory, right? So yeah, I would have to say that the location of the value judgment is subjective. It is implied. Right? The person making the statement doesn't have to say but, right? It can say Tom is cruel, he is not bad. Cruelty, right? Since it's a value judgment, people does not necessarily agree, right? Some people might think that some cruelty is necessary, or good even. Right? So maybe there is a significant difference, right? Bad is always bad, right? That my value judgment about something being bad is that it's always bad. I don't like it, right? That's it. Well, or I don't want to like it, right? Ethically, I think it's ethically should not be done, right? Like cruelty. Right. Like the bad boy. What is that? Like a thief? For example, if you like the bad boys, you may be attracted to a thief even though you don't like thiefdom, right? Thievery, right? You might think thievery is bad and people shouldn't do it, but you might still be attracted to it. That makes sense? So bad is always bad, but cruel isn't necessarily bad. Right, if such a statement does sound non-contradictory, we can conclude that a negative evaluation of Tom is not intrinsic to saying that he is cruel, and thus not semantically conveyed. Yeah, I agree with that, yeah. I don't even see it as a debate. I say, yeah, that is the case, right? Because it is non-contradictory. Yeah, it is not non-contradictory. Yeah. Despite the widely expected relevance of such linguistic data, that is, the author's own intuitions about what linguistics intuitions most people have, no systemic empirical studies have been conducted on thick concepts and their evaluative dimension. Fuck, I'm confused again. Cruel was a thick word, right? Evaluative dimension, right? The concept of cruel then should not really have an evaluative dimension. It is between the line, right? So it is any empirical study would not be a study of the concept. It would be a study of a certain population's attitude towards said concept. Think of a Mad Max kind of reality. Their cruelty is or a real life example, right? In high school, for example, cruelty is lifted up and seen as something positive, right? If you make fun and bully someone, you might get positive. Right? People might evaluate you as being cool when you're being cruel, right? So the empirical study would not be studying the evaluative dimension at all. It would just be studying sociology, like group psychology, something like that. Right? I think so, yeah. This is even more surprising, given that in experimental linguistics, empirical means to test whether a statement sounds contradictory are readily available. Oh, is it? Perhaps the most widely used test is the Cancelability Test. Take a bit of information for which it is unclear whether it is merely conversationally implicated or semantically connected to a concept or sentence. Then explicitly cancel this bit of information and see if the resulting phrase sounds contradictory. Oh, that's exactly what we did. Right? We tried this out. Tom is cruel, but he's not bad. Alright, so the value judgment is not necessarily there. It is implicated, yeah. Isn't that the cancelability test? I like that. In two recent papers, 2020 and 2021. All right, and by doing the doing the empirical test like this, you can come to a conclusion and say, like, in general, right? If you take a big enough data sample, you can say that in general, if most people find this non-contradictory, then we can... No, the only conclusion we can draw is that most of the people... We can only make a statement about the data set, right? The set that the data is collected from, right? So if I go out and just ask random people in Sweden, I can only say that this is about people in Sweden, right? People in Sweden think this way. It doesn't say anything about the word in itself. With that kind of logic, can you really study semantics at all? It feels like semantics is not really an empirical study then, is it? Semantics is kind of an... Semantics is a system for understanding language, right? And that is a private matter, like a personal thing. That you can study semantics and make it make sense to you, but you cannot say that the words themselves mean anything, right? Because words themselves are inherently arbitrary. So you can mix in pragmatism in there and say most people agree that this is the case. Right. And I will probably find myself in contradiction with the empirical evidence, though, which becomes interesting, right? Because to me, it sounds non-contradictory, right? But I could take a guess that a lot of people just looking at this, Tom is cruel, but he's not bad. A lot of people would write, if they just got a questionnaire in front of them and they had to see this sentence and say, does this sound like a contradiction? Yes or no? I could imagine that a lot of people would say yes, and I would say no. Right? So my semantics would be at odds with a lot of other people. But I could argue, right? Like I have, right? I did argue my side of this, and we could discuss it, and I could probably convince other people to see it my way. Because in my mind, there has to be a value judgment, and these are two separate value judgments, right? And since they are two separate value judgments, they cannot be contradictory, right? It is kind of it's kind of a grammatical trick by just putting the but here, right? You could remove the but from the sentence. Remove the but. All right. Tom is cruel. He is not bad. If you remove the but, the contradiction kind of goes away with it, doesn't it? Tom is cruel, he's not bad. You can even remove this comma sign, right? You can say Tom is cruel, dot, a period sign, and then Tom is not bad. And you can separate the two value judgments easily. So it's kind of... It's not a bad... It's not a very good design for this kind of test, right? Because how it is phrased kind of generates contradictory feelings. which is not a semantic or value judgment about cruelty or badness. It's about this part, right? This part generates contradictory stuff. And I could probably argue that and convince people to agree with me. Some people might not, and some people might. But if it is the case that a lot of people would say that it is contradictory, I would say that that is not enough for me to make any statements about thick and thin concepts. Yeah. Interesting. Two recent papers, right. 2021, Kevin Reuter and I aim to determine whether the evaluation of thick concepts is communicated by semantic or pragmatic means by using the cancelability paradigm. I really hope they didn't do that using this as a linguistic example. Hopefully they made a bad example on purpose. Otherwise, these studies, I kind of want to say that the data has been way too fiddled with from the get-go. Right. We reason that if pragmatists are correct and the evaluative aspects is only conversationally implicated, cancelling the evaluation should not lead to a contradiction. Take for instance the sentence, "There is the door." Right. This statement not only communicates the location of a door, but in some context carries the particularized conversational implicature that the addressee is asked to leave the room. Sure, yeah. Still saying "there is the door," but by that I am not saying that you should leave, does not yield a contradiction. Exactly. Yeah, I like that example. Generalized conversational implications, maybe, work similarly, but depend less on the specific context. Here is the scale that I was talking about earlier, right? If the evaluation of a thick term is conversationally implicated, cancelling the evaluation should be equally non-contradictory. Yeah. Equally, that's very black binary viewing, right? I think the thick and thin distinction doesn't really work out. Not as they have been operationalized in this text. Right. If such empirical evidence were to be found, this would count as direct support for the pragmatist position, which treats the evaluation as a conversational implicature. I always take the pragmatist view, don't I? I tend to do that. In contrast, semantic separabilists claim that the evaluative component cannot be cancelled. For example, a person who says, "What Tom did was rude," but by that I'm not saying something negative about Tom. Makes an infelicious statement? Yeah. But the implication is there, right? You only think that, right? That's an assumption on the evaluators of this sentence, right? If you think what Tom did was bad, right, you can agree that it was rude, but it might not have been bad. Right? You might think that, sure, it was rude, but his behavior was kind of neutral. Right? You can have that. What's an example of that? Right? Let's say you come and ask me for a piece of candy. And I say, "No, you can't have any. I have bag of candies here and I'm eating my candies and you ask me for a piece and I say no. And your reaction to that is, oh, that was rude. I might agree, sure it was rude, but I didn't do anything negative towards you, right? I wasn't being a bad friend or a bad person, right? It might have been in context rude, but right, you can create examples of that. Right? Otherwise, since language is inherently arbitrary, we might just have different definitions of the word rude, different understandings. Right? Some people might just be in that case where they see the word rude as being always bad. And I would argue against that, but as a semantic structure around the word or the concept, I would. But if they do that, that's fine. But that's about them, not about the language, not about thick and thin language, right? That means that thick and thin, the division between the two things are inherently subjective and arbitrary just because it's whatever the person thinks. And that kind of makes it, the thick and thin distinction becomes useless in that point, I would say. Our study yielded surprising results, alright. First, neither the prediction of the pragmatist view nor the semanticist view were met. Interesting. Right, neither predictions. Alright, they didn't reach any statistically significant... Wait, no, that would be the pragmatist prediction, right? That people have different ideas, and therefore no significance... Well, I don't know. Alright. Against the pragmatist's prediction, the evaluation of a thick concept was significantly harder to cancel than the conversationally implicated content and resulted in a higher contradiction ratings. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. Right? That wasn't that kind of my prediction, right? That I would be at odds with this rudeness thing. Right. This effect persisted for two different embeddings of thick terms, behavior and character. Right. Challenging the semanticists, the evaluation of thick concepts was significantly easier to cancel than that of the semantically entailed content.
It's down there somewhere. Let me take another look.
What do you mean? What does this mean? Wait. Yeah, it's like I started out saying, right? There's a scale. Some concepts will be harder to... right? Some people, a lot of people will see, right? Tom is a torturer. But that doesn't mean that Tom is a bad person. Right? That is even stronger, right? You will have even more people saying that is a contradiction, right? That makes sense because that is how people think. But it's not necessarily that way. Right? What's an example of a good person who's a torturer? Oh, right. One way of looking at torture is that modern day interrogations are a form of torture. But you don't see interrogators like police solving a murder. You don't see those as bad people. You don't see... Well, Sherlock is kind of a bad person. I don't know. What's some other famous detective interrogator? And you don't see them as bad people, necessarily. Even though it's kind of kind of in the same realm as torture, what they're doing when they do that stuff. Alright, second, going beyond the philosophical dispute and each side's respective predictions, we assume that polarity, positive versus negative, might play a role in how simple it would be to cancel the evaluation of a thick concept. Might be, yeah. We have not seen any suspicion along these lines in the metaethical literature, but given what we know from the experimental philosophy of morality, this was a possibility worth exploring. Indeed, yeah, that is interesting. Our study revealed a strong polarity effect on contradiction ratings. For positive thick terms, contradiction ratings were significantly lower than those of negative thick terms, as well as semantic entailments. This polarity effect is hitherto unknown and has not been predicted by any of the various accounts of thick concepts. In fact, the effect challenges the tacit assumption that thick terms and concepts form a homogeneous group of which we can ask broad questions about separability and how evaluation and description are connected. Alright, mouthful. Yeah, that was what I said from the get-go as well, right? That it's not a homogeneous group, it's a scale of things. And I can imagine, right, that negative concepts are more... They get more intertwined with, like, rude, torturer, stuff like that. They get more entrenched together with the badness, right? I gave you a piece of candy, but by saying that does not mean that I'm saying that I'm a good person, right? That's way easier to separate good concepts. That makes sense to me that I found that, yeah. Kevin Reuter and I happily admit that for the time being we can only speculate as to why the polarity effect occurs. Yeah, of course it's just speculation, but it makes sense from a psychology point of view, right? We are negatively biased. We tend toward noticing and remembering negative stuff, right? That sounded like toxicity. Eating seeds is the best time activity. Alright. Let's say I get up from here and I go to the bathroom 100 times. 100 times I get up and go to the bathroom and come back. 10 of those times I'm gonna step on a Lego. Which of the times will I remember? Which will have the greatest impact? What will I think about going to the bathroom? Won't like it. I'm gonna be pissed. There are Legos everywhere. Fucking bathroom route. I don't like it. Right? But we work like that. Psychologically speaking. So it kind of makes sense, but I would concede that that is just speculation, right? From previous knowledge. Alright. We outlined several possibilities on our paper, and I imagine that what I said is one of them, and they have more, like there are more things that feed into why it works like this. Yeah. Together with Lucien Baumgartner, we are in the process of exploring these explanations more systematically, and we are also developing new experimental approaches to evaluate language, including other experimental paradigms and corpus linguistic approaches. See Reuter, Baumgartner, and Willemsen, MS? Alright, the investigation of thick concepts is very much in its infancy. However, by applying a very simple experimental paradigm to sentences that so far have only been used as thought experiments and philosophical intuition pumps, we have already empirically challenged two of the most prominent views on thick concepts, as well as shared two assumptions that positive and negative thick concepts communicate evaluation in the same way. Right, yeah, you have done that through empiricism, but I mean, I'm not super impressed by this. This feels like a lot of philosophers just discussed one thing and got tunnel vision in that kind of discussion, right? Because my understanding of thick and thin concepts, like, I kind of rejected it outright, right? None of these findings surprised me. And I didn't do any empirical studies on this, right? So, I don't know. I think just the thought experiments from the get-go was badly designed. That's what I think. But maybe I just haven't understood it well enough. Maybe. Alright. This seems to be enough seems enough to motivate a much larger empirical investigation of thick concepts and normative language more generally. That I agree with, though, yeah. Definitely. Right? They came to similar conclusions to what I came with my intuition pumps. With my just intuition, I came to similar conclusions that they did. But even if we came to other stuff, right? Anytime you find stuff that... Anytime when you make a study, there are arguments to motivate you to make more studies, right? Especially when it's, like they say, right? It's a fairly new idea, a new way of viewing semantics and stuff. Yeah, it's great. Study some more. Maybe you will figure out even more stuff. Right? Just because, like, that's kind of the whole deal with qualitative and quantitative studies, like I said in the beginning, right? We do the thought experiments and the intuition pumps. We do those things to design studies and create science, right? We move away from philosophy into science. We move from hypothesis into theory, right? We move from guess into knowledge. Right? That's what empiricism is all about. And isn't that just science in a nutshell, right? It all starts out with philosophy, and then you make observations and empirical tests, and you either reject or keep the ideas generated from philosophy, right? Isn't it? Right, number 4. Independent of the linguistically driven debate in metaethics, it has been argued that thick concepts possess an important connection to action. This is what I have called the Action-Guidingness question. Take as an example a friend telling you that your behavior at the party last night was rude. In addition to simply communicating her disapproval, you might infer an even more far-reaching communicative goal. Your friend does not want you to behave in the same way at the next party. Yeah, right. That's in context. In that context, sure, yeah. What she tries to do is to make you change your behavior. Yep. Bernard Williams, 1985, offered one of the earliest and most influential attempts to define thick concepts in terms of their potential to guide action. Right. The way these notions are applied is determined by what the world is like, for instance by how someone has behaved, and yet at the same time their application usually involves a certain value of the situation, of person or actions. Moreover, they usually, though not necessarily directly, provide reasons for actions. Yeah, in contexts. Right. That's kind of why I have a little problem with how the... I don't know how the study was designed, right? But you're creating a context, right? You're always creating a context in where stuff is been said, right? Me not giving you candy and you saying that is rude, definitely that's action related. You want some candy and you want to change my behavior. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you value judge that I'm a bad person or bad friend. It's all context. It's all context, right? In the party you might say that was rude, and then you start laughing. Then you might not even try to change someone's actions. I mean, communication is hard, right? It takes so much more than just the language itself, right? It's body language and context and everything. Right, many have adopted this suggestion in addition to being endorsed by many scholars. It seems that the idea of thick concepts being connected to actions adequately captures what people mean to communicate by calling someone else rude or cruel. Yeah, right. Even when we say that a person is rude or cruel, we're thinking of specific examples of their behavior, right? We're actually doing the same as well, right? If I say that that person is bad, then I have a collection of reasons, of actions that person has made to call that person bad. It is the same, it's just it has less specific actions, right? These are more specific, while bad is less specific. I would even say that cruel is more specific than rude, because of, in my understanding, like in how I use these words, how I understand these words. Yeah. Right. After speaking at length about how metaethics could profit from experimental results, of course it can. It might be not come as a surprise that I believe that even an idea this plausible requires empirical support. Alright, ultimately, whether thick concepts have the disposition to guide actions is a matter of their psychological effect on people. Judith Martens and I have started to investigate the action-guidingness of thick concepts. Yeah, right. It is used like, just think about action-guidingness. Of course that is the case, right? That is how we raise children, right? That was rude. Don't be cruel. Don't be rude. Be polite, right? Of course there is, in some situations, and probably in a lot of our minds, there is action-guidingness. Like if someone calls us rude, depending on our upbringing from our parents, right? If someone calls me rude, then I might consider my actions and change my actions because I don't want to be too rude, right? I tend to be somewhat rude at times, but I try to not be. If someone calls me cruel, that really makes me consider my actions, right? Do I think that I was cruel? Oh man, maybe I should, well, first of all, tell them I'm sorry and try and change my my behavioral patterns, right? If I have cruel behavioral patterns. Right. We believe that to develop proper metaethical theory of thick concepts and their relationship to actions, we need to understand A, whether there are circumstances in which thick concepts provides reasons for action. Yeah, and I think this is where it becomes, and they will find a problem in this study, is right, thinking that it's just the concepts, right? It's about people, right? This study is not about language. It's about people and how people think in regards to this language. And trying to look at it as a metaethical language idea, right? Metaethical linguistic idea, they will run into problems. That's what I predict, yeah. And B, whether there are circumstances in which thick concepts do not provide reasons for actions. Right? I've already given examples for both of those, right? Yeah, I've given examples, and those examples, right? I mean, they are anecdotal, but they have happened in my life, and you can find the same, right? So it's, you know that you can find both. We know that for a fact. Just the interesting question with empirical studies, right? That's not about metaethics. Well, you can use that in a metaethical discussion, I suppose, but that is right. Differences between different concepts, different words. What about the difference between rude and cruel? What about differences between good and bad words? Like, or different, like you can compare different cultures. How do they see this differently, right? So there's value in study many of these things because we learn about the human race, and we can use that knowledge about the human race in our metaethical discussion. It doesn't lead to a conclusion about metaethical theory, right? It's supportive arguments for one way of looking at the world or another. That's the whole thing with philosophy. As long as you have evidence and that kind of theory, it's not philosophy anymore. Then it's science, and you can't metaethics, reducing that to a science. It's not. I don't think it's doable, right? Because of the simple reason that ethics and codes of ethics and morality and all those things are always subjective, right? You can only make statements about a specific group of people, a specific culture, yeah. Not about any objective sense about the language or ideas like that, no. Alright, and C, what I also want to look for is how these two classes of circumstances differ from another. That is interesting, yeah. The differences. As a first study, Willemsen and Martin's MS, we tested the idea that thick concepts have the disposition to provide reasons for actions, especially when a person is reasoning about what would be best to do. Participants were presented with the following prompt. Alright. Sally is struggling with a decision on how she should act. The situation is tricky and Sally has several alternative options. To decide which options she should choose, Sally makes a list of things that count against and in favor of each of these options, and also of things that speak neither against nor in favor of these options. Sally thinks about option A and writes down, doing this would be term. Wait. Alright, so she makes a pro and con list Right, Sally makes a list of things to count against and in favor of each of these options, and also things that speak neither against nor in favor. Just neutral stuff. Doing this would be yeah, this question is weird. Right. Let's say painting the house green would make the house green. That's a neutral aspect, right? That is not relevant for struggling with this decision. It's not, it's just... Right. The house would be green, right? It has to be opinions, right? When it has to be pro and con. Do you like the idea of a green house or don't you like the idea of a green house? Right. Putting anything else down on the list, right? Just... Right. You can end up in a scale here as well, but just neutral? I don't think so, right? I can't even come up with a neutral thing, right? Things that are not in favor or... It seems like it would just be stuff that is not relevant. The results suggest that in context of self-reflection, when an individual is attempting to determine the best course of action, thick terms strongly count in favor or against an option. Yeah, definitely. Descriptive terms do not share this disposition in this context. It seems that philosophers have been right all along in their assumption that thick concepts have the potential to guide actions. Haven't they just flipped everything around? You use these thick concepts as a structure, like you'd make a pro and con list. That is a method for reaching decisions, right? Making those kind of pro and con stuff, right? Your opinions matter, right? If you didn't care, like, let's say you're a narcissist that don't care if you're rude to anyone, right? You don't care. Right? If you make a pro and con list, your level of rudeness would not be part of that pro and cons list. Because it doesn't matter to you. At the same time, you wouldn't use, like a pro and con list, you wouldn't use this is bad as a con. Or this is good as a pro, because that's not part of the methodology that you're using, right? You need to describe why is this good, why is this bad, right? That's the pro and the con, right? That is good, that is bad. That's implicitly, right? But it's like, it would be similar to saying, all right, in the pro list, this is pro, right? It has pros. Yeah, there we go. That would be an entry, right? That would be equivalence of saying, in the pros, it has pros. In the cons, it has cons, right? It's redundant. You would not put that on the list. Right? Should I paint a house green? Pros and cons. Pros. The house would be green. You wouldn't put that on the list either, because it's super descriptive and you cannot use the... I'm not sure I agree with this conclusion. It seems weird. Alright. Building on Willemsen and Reuter, 2000 and 2021, Judith Martins and I also wondered how exactly reasons for actions are communicated. Again, there are at least two obvious options on the table. First, reasons for actions are communicated as a matter of the semantic meaning of thick concepts. Wait, two obvious options on the table. First, reasons for actions are communicated as a matter of semantic meaning of thick concepts. I reject that. I've rejected this completely, right? The value judgment happens within the person, right? It's not within the word. Value judgments are never in the word. Right? The words are representations of our value judgments. I say licorice is bad because I don't like licorice. And that doesn't make licorice bad. It just makes me telling you that I don't like licorice. It's just me representing my value judgment. Alternatively, uttering a thick term might simply conversationally implicate a reason for action. It might, yeah. Judith Martins and I used a variation of the cancelability test to determine how reasons for actions are communicated. We asked participants to please imagine that Sally said the following sentence. What Jim did last week was cruel, but by that I'm not saying that Jim should have acted in a different way. Here again they have this but structure. And it's kind of... they're kind of implying, right? They could have made this way better, right? And I think that's a big enough deal, right? This is priming enough, right? To make this and not have this problem, you would have to separate the two statements. More than this, right? You would have to have not like a short sentence like this. Maybe you should have like a short paragraph where it is separated. Well, it's difficult to separate them, but definitely more than this, right? Maybe what Jim did last week was cruel. Then another sentence. You just say something else randomly about last week. I don't know what. I'm not good at these things, but saying something else randomly. And then saying, I don't think that Jim should have acted in a different way last week. Right? Just separate them as much as possible, not to prime people into thinking, right? Marrying the two ideas, because oftentimes people do marry cruel with bad. And people who do cruel stuff should have done things differently. So it's a priming thing. But that's not... language is arbitrary. To our and potentially many philosophers' surprise, we made two findings. Interesting, yeah. First, the contradiction ratings for every single thick concepts we tested were significantly below the neutral midpoint and even lower than the cancelability ratings of conversational implicatures. Right. Oh, right. It was more difficult to cancel cruelty and acting in a different way, right? The value judgment. It was more difficult, but that wasn't a surprise. I mean, you told us before that this is kind of what happened, and that makes logical sense to me. We've talked about that before, so I don't know. Right. The action-related reason-giving component of a thick concept seems to be only very loosely connected to a thick concept. Secondly, the action-related reason-giving component of a thick concept seem to be only loosely connected to a thick concept. Yeah, that makes sense. Right. It's not loosely connected. It can be super strongly connected in context. In some contexts, in other not. So I think the role of the context is getting way too small room here, right? I would imagine that they would find loosely connected, right, as a grand statement, because in a few concepts, right, it is connected. In others, it is not. All right. Second, mirroring the findings of Kevin Reuter, Judith Martins and I also found significant polarity effects, such as negative terms received higher contradiction ratings. Yeah, and that makes sense. Right? We said that before. Again, I do not pretend to have sufficient grasp on what is going on here, and I believe that the journey into the exciting world of evaluative concepts have just begun. The reason I believe that this journey is worth traveling is that even in the first steps we have made exciting, surprising discoveries that suggest more questions and more answers. Alright, I would say, as my closing statements, because it's getting to lunchtime, and I'll read this tomorrow, my closing statements from reading this is Hume's guillotine, right? You cannot derive an is from an ought, right? Descriptive stuff describes reality, but you cannot derive a value without the personal opinion, right? Cannot derive an ought from an is. And it seems like it feels like that is what they're trying to do, right? Evaluative concepts. Right? A concept is, my understanding, right? It's a descriptor of the world, and you have an opinion about that description, right? Someone can be cruel, and we can all agree, like humanity can go together and make a definition of cruel where we all have, this is fine. We would describe torture as cruel, for example, and we all agree. Then we say that torture is cruel. We can say that. But the evaluation, my personal opinion about that cruelty, about torture and about cruelty, is my own subjective opinion and cannot be derived from this language. It's just not possible. It's always an opinion. Right. We do in our minds, however, very easily, right? Our minds are structured in that way that we oftentimes do, right? We do like marry two things, right? I marry torture with cruelty, with badness, because I think all the things that we call cruel, I think they are bad. Maybe not all of them, but most of them I think of as bad, and therefore when I hear the word cruel, that's simple behaviorism, right? That I hear the word cruel, I think bad, because that is how my mind works. But that doesn't necessarily make the concept of cruelty ethically bad. Cannot derive an is from an ought. Try and find an empirical way to do that. Yeah, that would be an interesting study. But that's my closing statements, and we'll continue to see the commentaries, see what Bianca comment tomorrow. Yeah, I think this was interesting. Alright, so thanks for hanging out. Have a good one. And yeah, see you next time. Cheers.